People have been using a number of words into designating this adaptable kind of design. How much this is different from real world data, real world evidence? Because you said that actually pragmatic gets you closer to real world, but this is not the same kind of evidence, right?
No, I think most people, when people talk about real world evidence, most people mean non-randomized evidence,
Observational.
which I mean, probably is a bit of a distraction to go into that. But I mean, suffice to say that real world evidence is really not about the real world. It's so messy and so biased that it's anything but the real world. It doesn't tell you anything about what's really happening.
And then there are also another type of designation called the randomized registry trials. Is it kind of pragmatic trial?
Well, registries can be used to help with the business of identifying people, because the work has already been done to identify people and put them into a registry. So that, as you know, because you're a trialist, a lot of the work is actually spent in trying to find people to enter into trials to test a question. If you already have a registry of people, then a lot of the work has been done for you, and some of those people can be potentially identified, but also perhaps even followed up. If the registry already has arrangements for follow-up, you can embed your trial within the registry and save duplicated effort, and save money and time. So
right.
It's really about trying to take what resources we have and use them efficiently to answer questions reliably. Often the problem with our trials is that they're too small, and particularly when we have large amounts of electronic health record data, we can get round the problem of trials that are too small by being ambitious and looking at very large numbers at the beginning, and once you've invited people and so on, you still have a very large number going into the trial. But there are, I mean, we're going to go on to talk about some of the problems with adaptable, but I think particularly when you have an open trial, there are some real challenges. And I wanted to get on to the point about, it's all very well having a streamlined trial, but you've got to know it's going to work before you start. And that was really the point I was trying to make in my editorial, that they knew before they started that the majority of people who were taking aspirin 81 milligrams, but it wasn't entirely clear how big that majority was. And I think that that's unfortunate. But what was still uncertain, even if you know that the majority is taking 81, you still don't know whether people would be happy to take 81 or 325. And what turned out was that they had a visit 1 to 3 weeks after randomization, and they discovered that in people who were randomized to 325, almost immediately within that first 3 weeks, about 40% of them switched to 81 milligrams. And going back to some of the elements I was talking about, whereby you end up with something reliable, the first thing, the fundamental principle is you've got to have randomization that creates balance between the groups in all the important prognostic factors, which of course simple randomization does. But here, with that kind of crossover, so soon after the start, it destroyed the randomization. So what I'm really arguing in my editorial is that this means you can't really interpret the trial result. It might look as though the two drugs were similar, but really no conclusion can be drawn because the randomization failed, or failed effectively. So whilst I'm thrilled that in the US, there's now this ability to do these very big trials, I just wanted to point out that had they done a pilot, even just a couple of hundred patients, they would have discovered this fact.
Good point. Very good point. Yes.
And so we're big advocates of pilots here in Oxford, and I know others around the world do the same. You learn a lot from a pilot. You learn some of the problems, and you can iron them out before you start, was once you press the button to go on a 15,000 patient trial, the design is fixed and you can't really, it's very difficult to unwind. Whereas if you're in a pilot and you discover, wow, this is all this crossover, then you could potentially think of ways, and I suggested maybe a factorial design with the two drugs doses at the crossover. There might be other ways of doing it, but at the very least you would have had an opportunity to try and change things before the big effort, 15,000 effort, went ahead. And so I think many trials would benefit from even just a brief pilot phase to make sure things really work before you press the button to go.
Yeah, and you made the point very nicely in your editorial. Fair enough. It's really a great point. So it all starts by equipoise, right? We really need to have equipoise so that the two groups randomized are accepting the therapy and that not much risk of drop-ins or drop-outs. Now, this mentioned that this is not a fix for every type of investigation. So what are the trials that may benefit from going pragmatic and trials which may not go for pragmatic? And I believe that approval trials will never be able to be pragmatic. Am I wrong with that?
Yes, you are. In the old days, we could get approval. I mean, ISIS-2 is a very good example. Where aspirin and streptokinase were approved on the basis of a very clear result on mortality. So it's not as though we haven't got examples of where things are, if you've got pragmatic elements to your design or streamlined elements, then provided that they preserve the really important aspects of the trial, then they will, the FDA, for example, is encouraging people to use these elements in their designs. They want us to do that. And because it makes sense from both a logistic and financial point of view, that there's really much more scope for people to do this. And I think there is a lot more interest in doing it.
Yeah, but Colin, when I mentioned approval trial, I was mentioning new therapy, new drugs, because of course you need to have the drug commercially available in order to get pragmatic design, right?
I think that the elements that we're talking about, whereby you look at barriers to recruitment, for example, are just as relevant to drugs before they are before they're licensed. I mean, why wouldn't they be? Why would you have a system of recruitment that is inefficient just because a drug hasn't been approved? So I think we need to get away from this idea that doing it a complicated and expensive way is the right way to do it, really. But then later on, once the drug's licensed, it's okay to do it in a simple and streamlined way. Actually, streamlined is in many cases better, because you end up with larger trials, you end up with the relevant information, you end up with more, for example, safety outcomes. So you're better able to advise people on the treatment effects. You can look at subgroups more reliably if you have larger numbers. So it isn't like this is some second tier of quality. The quality is, if anything, better because you've got more information.
Brilliant. Well, you made the point very clearly. You mentioned the European experience. You said that this adaptability is an American and one of its first kind in pragmatic trial, but we have a more important record of these pragmatic trials in Europe. Can you mention what is the experience so far in Europe?
Well, I mean, the ones that stick in my mind, I'm sure there are many examples, but the registry trials have been done out of Scandinavia, the TASTE study, and we of course have been doing our own studies here in Oxford, trying to streamline our trials for many years, starting right back with ISIS and going forward from there. And it might be worth mentioning that this pursuit of simplicity but reliability has saved our bacon in the COVID crisis because of the recovery trial, which I'll mention briefly. This is a trial. I'm sure everybody's very familiar with it, but it was developed extremely rapidly. The protocol was written, in days, and it was approved in days. And the first results came out 3 months after the trial was conceived. So, it was just extremely simple data collection, very, very few data points, extremely simple outcome measures, simple randomization. And it told us what we needed to know. And I mean, obviously, the best known example is, the best example rather is dexamethasone, which was shown to be very effective for people with severe disease. That is now randomized 40,000 people with COVID. We couldn't have done that. Some trials, once they got going, were too late. They came after the first wave, and a lot of the information, it was just too late. So I think that there is this particular example where we have to act quickly. We have to avoid all of the unnecessary bells and whistles that people insist on for trials. They're just not necessary to get reliable answers. And if we don't need them, and they actually prevent us from getting reliable answers, then we shouldn't use them.
Well, actually, among the various ways to designate the trial, I like the streamlined way. It's really very informative. It's better than simple or pragmatic, by the way. And the example in the COVID trials is wonderful. And by the way, really congratulations for the recovery experience so far. But what you have cited so far are single country experiences. You mentioned Oxford, Sweden, and now the United States. Is it true that this pragmatic trial will be difficult globally because you need to have some commonality in healthcare system, at least when it comes to, finding out patient in the screening electronic health bracket? How are the challenges of getting global with pragmatic trials?
Just to mention as a clarification, I'm not involved in the recovery trial. It's been led by Martin Landry and Peter Horby. What I've learned about recovery is just from conversations with them. But I know now that they are international. They've got other countries involved. So here's an example, a modern day example of an international streamlined trial. And actually, this is not the only example by any means, because streamlining means trying to identify people from available resources. So, for example, you don't have to have a registry necessarily. You might be able to interrogate patient lists at hospitals. You may be able to get consent to look at patient lists, and that's an approach that we've taken, for example, in renal disease. And you can identify people before you even start the trial, so that instead of waiting for the patient to come through the door, the investigators have a list of patients they can invite, and that's much more efficient to do a trial. And outcome collection, if simple data can be collected on a simple form, that doesn't depend, and you can translate to different languages easily using software. So there's no reason why streamlined trials can't be international.
Wonderful plea, and this is really a great advocacy for these, for doing more of these, actually.